I would like to know that. And so I ask you then, what I share with this pious trinity of the opposing team is a deeply pessimistic view of human history. I do not believe that if you let people run around loose, they're going to have nice ideas about each other, and they're going to behave nicely to each other, because that's not what they do. Their response is to cut off their lips and clamp on a padlock, to decide who should be in the Sanhedrin of the mind, who should be in the Sanhedrin of the soul, and sit around and tell you what you're allowed to say and what you're allowed to think. They do not understand that there is not agreement about this. They seem to assume that somehow or other it will always prevail. Yes, they say times change. Sometimes it's allowed to be racist. Sometimes it's allowed to be anti-racist. Sometimes we silence the people who are pro-Jewish. Sometimes we silence the people who are anti-Muslim. But that's okay because, we're just rolling with the times, right? And we're always going to let the people who we sort of think are civilized speak in the name of civility. I think that this is extremely dangerous. And I return that while they conclude that we must accept that because speech is limited, we must put ourselves in charge of limiting it, that we're dealing really here with a case of lesser evils. The question before us tonight, simply put, and simply stated in the proposition that we were given, is that freedom of speech must include a license to offend. I would expand that license to blaspheme, and I would not call it a license. They speak of it as a license. They think all speech is a license, that all speech should be licensed because most speech should be restricted before it is licensed. And then we decide, okay, we'll let this out, we'll let that out, we'll let this out, we'll let that out. I think that that's a very, very, very dangerous precipice on which they want to perch us. I do not trust them, even though I think that they're probably more trustable than most. But what is to say that they will stay in charge of that speech? What is to say that we will not fall into the hands of somebody we don't trust? What is to say that the message, which one day seems somewhat sane, the next day becomes to kill, and that the people who say, let us not kill, are silenced in the name of reasonable speech, in the name of civilization, to moderate that? I remind you one last time, as you go to vote, if you believe in chopping off lips and clamping on padlocks on open mouths, there's your troika.
That was Philip Gourevitch. Next, against the proposition, David Cesarani.
Right. Well, first of all, I want to thank Philip for summarizing, well, actually repeating verbatim something that I wrote in the Guardian. I stand by every word, and it's saved me a bit of time. I do think it is possible for reasonable people, like the people in this room, to decide what is offensive and what is dangerous. And Murray, in a very modest and less flamboyant way, tried to set out what it is that is offensive and what is dangerous. I don't think it's really necessary to bother to respond to the very foolish idea of what this side of the House is advocating. We are not advocating cutting off people's lips. We're not even advocating repealing the First Amendment. We're not even advocating special laws that will have people banged up in prison for saying things that we don't like. We're just asking you, and I'm asking this as a foreigner, as someone who is British, to just reflect with a little humility on American society and culture, and reflect while holding in mind the fact that in most other liberal democracies there are modest constraints on what can be said and written, and for good reason too. And most international conventions that set out freedoms also include constraints on the freedom of expression, most notably the European Convention on Human Rights. And the reason is that the European Convention on Human Rights that was passed in 1950 was framed against the background of genocide, mass murder, persecution, totalitarianism in Europe. When men and women had seen the effect, the drip effect of hate speech, words that demeaned, that degraded, and resolved that freedom of speech could no longer be considered an absolute right. It was a right. It was a fundamental element of liberty. But it was not absolutely overriding because it was open to abuse. It was abused in Europe. It's abused now. And I'd say it's actually abused here. Philip Gourevitch said rather mockingly that we came to you to ask you to get real. I'm going to repeat that. Get real. There was a little article in The Guardian which amused me. Apparently, a few days ago, a meeting to be addressed by a colleague of mine, Tony Judd, a historian who I rate enormously highly. A meeting that he was to address was cancelled because of a phone call from Abe Foxman. I don't know if Abe Foxman is in this audience now, but he's obviously a very powerful man. Just with the tone of his voice, he can have meetings cancelled. He can have freedom of expression curtailed. I think that is an abuse of power. I think that it is very dangerous that people can phone up organizations and have meetings cancelled because they don't like not what the speaker is actually going to address, but other things that he has spoken about. Tony Judd has written some things about Israel that Abe didn't like, so Abe phoned up the Polish consulate and said, "Do you really want to have that guy speaking on your premises?" Now, get real. You have constraints on freedom of expression in this great country. And what we are asking you to do is reflect with a little bit of humility of how you want those constraints to be exercised by the most powerful, the most ruthless, the ones with the biggest bank balances, the ones with the most votes, or do you want to have a public debate about how you protect those who are weak, who are vulnerable, who are defenseless, and who are marginal, and who are often abused in the mass media or in work settings, as Mari mentioned? I think the real choice is not whether you're in favor of absolute freedom of speech or constraints on freedom of speech tonight, but whether you're going to be realistic or whether you're going to be smug and hypocritical and walk out of this hall thinking, this is the land of the free, land of the brave, no such things as restrictions on freedom of speech here, and we don't want to be lectured about that by some limey. And recite to yourselves happily Milton, Locke, Mill, without actually knowing very much about what Milton, Locke, Mill had to say about freedom of expression. Because for none of these men was freedom of expression a good in itself. It was always a means to an end. For Milton, who didn't like Catholics, it was to expose the fallacies of Catholicism prior to crushing them, eradicating them. For Locke, it was simply a means to good governments. For Mill, it was to advance education and truth. And as soon as Mill considered the possibility of uneducated mass audiences, he panicked and resiled. He went back on everything that he said about unlimited freedom of speech. And I'm going to read out what John Stuart Mill had to say. Acts of whatever kind, which without justifiable cause do harm to others, may be, and in the more important cases, absolutely required to be controlled by the unfavorable sentiments and, when needful, by the active interference of mankind. And he included speech acts. And the notorious wonderful example he gave is the folly of allowing a man at a time of famine to inveigh against grain dealers outside the home of a grain dealer before a public that is hungry and ill-educated and not terribly reasonable. That, unfortunately, is the state of our society today. There are a lot of people who are unreasonable, who are ill-educated, who are angry about this and that, and there are plenty of people who want to stir the pot and who want to incite them. And John Stuart Mill, who understood the perils of mass society, also understood that we are no longer conducting this discussion amongst a nice, homogeneous elite, but we are having to deal with huge numbers of people in divided, conflicted societies. And I think, and I'm an optimist, not like Philip Gourevitch, that we have it within our power, thinking and working together, to agree on what can and cannot be said, should and should not be said, to avoid conflict, to avoid people standing outside the homes of grain merchants and inveighing against their business. This is what Timothy Garton Ash wrote recently in The Guardian. We need to wake up to the seriousness of the danger